It was supposed to be a quick escape, just a weekend hike to clear my head. I had taken this trail before, nothing dangerous, nothing too remote. But this time, the weather had turned quicker than expected. The snow started falling light, almost peaceful, like nature was tucking the world in. But within an hour, it thickened, swallowing the trail and muting everything except the sound of my own breath and crunching boots. I should have turned back when the snow got heavy, but I told myself it would let up. It always did. That's how these things start, right? A small decision, a bit of overconfidence, and then the cold starts slipping into your bones before you even realize it's got you. The trees blurred in white haze, and soon I couldn't tell which direction I had come from. Panic hadn't set in yet. Just a numb kind of worry that kept whispering, "You're not lost. Not yet." That's when I saw the cabin. It stood crooked between the trees, almost leaning into the storm, half buried under snow. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, thin and gray against the white sky. Relief flooded me. Shelter, warmth, a miracle in the middle of nowhere. I knocked on the door, called out. No answer, but the door creaked open and warmth spilled out. Inside, it was quiet, the air heavy with old wood and dust, like the cabin had been asleep for years. A fire burned low in the hearth, and an old wool blanket was draped across a wooden rocking chair. No sign of anyone. It felt lived in, but abandoned all at once. I hesitated only a second before stepping in. The cold outside made the decision for me. I sat by the fire, warming my fingers, feeling them sting as sensation returned. I called out again. Nothing. Maybe the owner was out. Maybe they left in a hurry. Maybe they wouldn't mind a stranded hiker taking refuge. I told myself a lot of things to make it feel okay. That night, I tried to sleep on the floor near the fire. Wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and somewhere far off, I thought I heard something move in the woods, but it was just a storm, just the wind. That's what I kept telling myself. Around midnight, the rocking chair began to move, slowly, back and forth. Creak, creak, creak. I stared at it, heart pounding. There was no draft, no reason for it to move on its own. I sat up, eyes locked on it, waiting for it to stop. It didn't. It rocked slowly, steadily, like someone unseen was sitting in it, staring right at me. I didn't sleep the rest of In the morning, the fire had burned out, and the cabin was freezing again. I tried the door. It was stuck, frozen shut. I pushed harder, even kicked it, but it wouldn't budge. The windows wouldn't open either. The storm outside was worse than before. I was trapped for now. That's when I noticed the photographs on the wall. Faded black and white portraits of people with hollow expressions, men, women, children, all staring out blankly. But there was something wrong about them. Each had their eyes scratched out, like someone had violently taken a knife to every single one. And beneath each frame, a name. But none of the names made sense. They were all variations of my own. My full name, nicknames, misspellings. I couldn't look away. It was like they'd been waiting for me. I stepped back, heart racing, and noticed the mirror above the fireplace. It wasn't reflecting the room properly. The chair was empty in real life, but in the mirror, something sat in it. Something hunched, shadowy, barely shaped like a man. Its head turned toward me, and though it had no face, I knew it was looking straight into my soul. I turned away, breathing hard. When I looked again, the mirror was blank, just a reflection of me, pale and wide-eyed. I decided to go upstairs, hoping maybe there was a back door or another way out. The second floor was even colder, untouched by heat. Dust coated everything. In the corner room, I found an old journal, half frozen and covered in cobwebs. The handwriting was jagged, frenzied. I flipped through the pages. They don't let you leave. Every time you think the storm clears, it comes again. I've seen them watching through the trees. They mimic the ones who try to help. Even your voice becomes theirs. I dropped the journal when I heard footsteps downstairs. I crept down slowly, heart hammering in my chest. I saw footprints in the snow that had been tracked across the wooden floor. Wet, fresh, but they weren't mine. They led from the door to the fireplace, then disappeared. The chair was rocking again. This time I saw it. Not a full figure, just a shape, darker than the rest of the room, hunched over, its arms resting on the chair arms. It tilted its head as if curious, as if listening. I backed away slowly, gripping the staircase railing. That's when I heard my voice. It came from the chair, my voice, my exact voice, whispering things I hadn't said, fragments of thoughts I hadn't spoken aloud, regrets, fears, secrets I thought no one knew. It was like the thing had reached inside my head and pulled out pieces of me. I ran to the kitchen, desperate to find something. An axe, a knife, anything. The drawers were empty. The cabinets led to nowhere. The pantry had no back wall, just endless black and faint scratching sounds inside it, like something crawling toward me. The storm raged louder. The cabin groaned. I heard voices outside, people calling my name. I rushed to the window but saw no one, just white, endless white. Then, the door swung open on its own. No wind behind it. The snow hadn't even disturbed the doorstep. But in the middle of the floor now stood a pair of boots, my boots, but they were covered in ice and blood. I didn't remember bleeding. I didn't remember taking them off. I realized something. The cabin didn't want me to leave. It never did. It showed me warmth to bring me in, it used my memories to keep me afraid, and now it was wearing me. I saw myself standing in the mirror again, but I wasn't moving. The reflection grinned while I stood motionless. I don't know how many days have passed now. The storm hasn't let up. I still hear footsteps at night, and the chair keeps rocking. I tried to burn the place down, but the fire won't catch. I tried screaming, but now when I open my mouth, nothing comes out, only wind, cold wind. The cabin still looks abandoned from the outside, empty, safe, but it's not. It never was. And when someone else finds it, because they will, they'll walk right in like I did, feel the fire, take comfort in the warmth, and they'll never leave either, because I didn't just get lost in a snowstorm. The snowstorm found me. I was staying at my uncle's cabin for the winter, something I hadn't done in years. He had passed away 6 months prior. My family hadn't gotten around to selling the property yet. So, when I needed a break from the noise of the city, I figured a week in the quiet snow-covered woods wouldn't hurt. Just me, a wood-burning stove, a stack of books, and a storm rolling. Peaceful. The first 2 nights were uneventful. The cabin was exactly how I remembered it. Wooden walls with framed photographs, a rustic kitchen, and an attic that always felt colder than it should. On the third night, the snowstorm began, heavy and relentless, the kind of snowfall that made the world vanish just outside the window. I watched flakes swirl past the glass, while the wind howled like a dying animal. It was beautiful, until I started hearing things. At first, I dismissed it as the wind or my imagination playing tricks, but then I heard footsteps crunching in the snow. Not the rhythmic shuffle of falling snow clumps. These were deliberate, steady, approaching steps. I peeked out the window, heart pounding. Nothing, just snow and trees. But the sound continued, circling the cabin. The steps never faded, just moved around, slow and measured, as though someone were pacing just beyond my sight. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a fox, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Something about the sound was too human, too intentional. I locked the doors, drew the curtains, and sat close to the fireplace, trying not to let my nerves get the best of me. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I stepped outside. The snow was deep, untouched, except for a single set of footprints that started at the tree line and ended right at my front door. No return prints, just one path in. I followed them with dread crawling up my spine, but after about 20 feet, they just stopped, vanished, like whoever made them had been plucked right out of the snow. I stayed inside the rest of the day, trying to distract myself with books, trying not to look out the windows. But as night fell, the footsteps came back, slower, closer. I could hear them clearly through the walls, and then a knock on the door. Just one, firm, final. I didn't move. I didn't speak. But I swear I felt something on the other side. Breathing. Waiting. Eventually, it stopped. The knock. The steps. The sound. Everything went still. That's when the power went out. The entire cabin plunged into blackness, save for the flickering firelight. I lit candles, heart racing, every shadow stretching across the walls like reaching hands. I thought about trying the generator outside, but there was no way I was stepping into that storm again. Not with something out there. That's when I heard the attic door creak open. I froze. I hadn't gone near it since I arrived. The ladder had been up. I had no reason to go there. But now it hung open, swinging gently. I called out foolishly, like maybe a reasonable explanation would respond, but there was only silence. I took a candle and climbed up. The attic was colder than I remembered, and the air smelled strange, metallic, old. I scanned the space slowly, the candlelight barely illuminating the far corners. Nothing, just boxes, old furniture, and dust. But when I turned to go back down, something caught my eye. A figure, faint, at the far end of the attic. It stood perfectly still, hunched slightly, like it had been waiting there in the dark. I couldn't make out any features, only the outline, and two dull glints where eyes should be. I dropped the candle in panic and scrambled down the ladder, slamming the attic door shut behind me. I spent the rest of the night downstairs, wrapped in every blanket I could find, axe in hand, fire burning bright. I didn't sleep. Every time the wind rose, I thought I heard footsteps again. Every creak of the wood, every whisper of snow outside the window sent my heart pounding. At dawn, I decided I was leaving. Screw the storm. I packed up quickly, threw on my coat, and stepped outside. That's when I saw the footprints again. But this time, there were two sets, one leading to the door and one leading away. I followed the second set, hoping, stupidly, that it would lead to answers. But after a few yards, they split. One path went toward the woods. The other circled back behind the cabin. I turned to look and felt my blood run cold. There, behind the house, etched into the snow, was a message. written in long, wide tracks, like someone had crawled through the snow with outstretched limbs. "You let me in." I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't care if I froze to death trying to reach the road. I don't even remember how I made it to the ranger station. Just that when I got there, shaking, half hypothermic, and rambling like a lunatic, they didn't laugh. Because apparently, I wasn't the first to show up like that. I was a long-haul trucker for over a decade, but after years of sleepless nights and lonely roads, I decided to take a quieter job, snow plowing for the county during winter. The pay wasn't great, but I liked the solitude. Just me, the engine's low rumble, and endless miles of snow-covered roads winding through desolate mountain routes, peaceful in its own eerie way. One route in particular always made me uneasy, County Road 14. It was a remote stretch through dense forest, barely maintained, always blanketed with thick snowdrifts. Locals called it Widow's Hollow, though no one ever explained why. I figured it was just old folklore, but something about that road always made me feel watched. The night it happened, there was a brutal snowstorm, visibility barely a few feet, and my headlights felt swallowed by the white. Still, duty called. I was on my usual route, plowing through Widow's Hollow, when I saw the first sign that something was off. It was a man walking in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, nearly skidding sideways. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there with his back to me, wearing a heavy coat and no hat, his dark hair soaked with snow. I honked the horn, but he didn't react. I even rolled down the window and yelled out, asking if he needed help. Nothing. Finally, I stepped out of the cab and called again. He didn't even turn around. The snow was piling up fast, and I was starting to feel the cold bite through my gloves. I approached cautiously. "Sir, you okay out here?" Still no response. I was maybe 10 feet from him when he suddenly moved. Jerky, unnatural, like a puppet being yanked by strings. He turned his head slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his face. There was something wrong with it. Not deformed exactly, just wrong. Unsettling. His mouth was twisted into a grin that didn't match his dead eyes, and his skin was pale as the snow falling around us. I froze. Then, without a word, he stepped off the road and vanished into the woods. I stood there for him, unsure if I'd just imagined it, but the snow was already covering his footprints, except when I looked closely, there weren't any. Nothing, just smooth, untouched snow. I got back in the plow and continued down the road, heart hammering. The radio crackled softly, but no one was on the other end. The deeper into Widow's Hollow I drove, the worse it got. Something was off. The forest looked wrong, like the trees were bending toward the road, leaning in to listen. Shadows danced between the trunks, too tall and too fast for animals. Then I saw the man again, further up the road, standing by the tree line this time. Same coat, same twisted grin. I didn't stop this time. I gunned the engine and drove past, but my headlights flickered as I passed him, and for a split second, I swear he was inches from my window, face pressed to the glass. But when I looked, there was nothing there. I wanted to call dispatch, report something, anything, but my radio was dead. Not just static, dead. Silence. I kept driving, my nerves unraveling with every passing mile. That's when I hit something. The plow jolted and I slammed the brakes again. I thought maybe a branch or a log. But when I climbed out to check, I found something else entirely. A wooden cross, like a grave marker, half buried in the snow. Beside it, a second one, then a third, all of them in a neat row along the side of the road. I counted 14 in total, each carved with a name and a date. The last one had today's date and my name. I stumbled back in horror, slipping in the snow. I didn't understand. No one knew I was out here. No one could have made that. I looked around wildly, expecting to see someone watching me from the trees, but there was only darkness. I rushed back into the plow and turned around. I didn't care about finishing the route. I just wanted out. But the road behind me had changed. Where there had once been a clear path, now there were trees, dozens of them, thick, gnarled, and twisted, as if they had grown overnight. There was no way through. I was trapped. Panicking, I tried a side trail I'd never used before. It was narrow and winding, barely wide enough for the plow, but I had no choice. The snow grew heavier, the engine struggled, and the shadows in the woods seemed to follow me. That's when I saw the man again, this time ahead of me standing in the middle of the road. But this time, he wasn't alone. There were others, figures emerging from the trees, dozens of pale faces, twisted smiles, eyes hollow and black. They didn't move like people. They glided. Some crawled. One was hanging upside down from a tree limb, grinning as its head rotated impossibly to watch me pass. I floored it, careening down the trail, engine howling, snow blasting the windshield. Something slammed against the side of the plow. Then another. Claws, hands, fists, I don't know. They were trying to get in. I don't remember how I got out of that forest. One moment I was screaming behind the wheel, the next I was waking up in the driver's seat at the county garage, frost on the windows, and my plow parked neatly in its bay. The radio was working again. My supervisor said I had checked in over the radio 2 hours earlier, said everything was fine, but I didn't. I hadn't touched the radio since the start of my shift. I quit the next day. Sometimes I still see that road in my dreams, twisting trees, falling snow, and a line of wooden crosses stretching into the last one always has my name, and no matter how far I try to drive away, I always hear the crunch of footsteps behind me. It was supposed to be a quick overnight shift, nothing more than covering for a coworker at the mountain ranger station. I'd done it before. Just monitor the radios, check weather alerts, log a few reports, and maybe sip on some hot coffee while the snow fell quietly outside. The station sat high up near Timberline Ridge, isolated from the nearby town by 15 miles of forest and winding road, beautiful during the day, unsettling at night. The snowstorm started around 6 p.m. Heavy flakes, thick winds, whiteout conditions in every direction. I logged the storm alert and settled in. The power flickered once but held. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat near the window, watching the snow paint the trees in a thick veil of white. At first I didn't notice anything unusual, just silence and snow. Then the radio crackled. It wasn't the usual weather chatter or neighboring rangers checking in. It was faint, static, followed by what sounded like breathing. Then a voice, distant and low. "Help me!" I leaned forward, unsure if I'd heard it right. The signal was weak, barely audible, but it repeated, "Please, help me." I adjusted the frequency, thinking maybe it was a distress signal from a hiker caught in the storm. But the more I listened, the stranger it became. The voice didn't sound panicked. It sounded tired, hollow, like whoever was speaking was barely hanging on. I tried responding. "Station 47 to unidentified signal. Come in. What's your location?" Nothing, just static. Then, a chilling whisper. "Behind you." I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly turned around. Nothing, just the dim interior of the station. Bookshelves, equipment racks, the hallway leading to the back bunk room. I chuckled nervously, shaking off the tension. Probably just interference, I told myself, my nerves playing tricks. Still, I walked the perimeter of the cabin with a flashlight, checked the doors, the windows, everything. Locked tight. No footprints in the snow outside. No signs of anyone out there. When I came back inside, something was wrong. The coffee mug I'd left on the desk was empty. Not tipped over, just drained. I knew I hadn't touched it. I would have heard it clink or fall. I stared at it for a moment, unsettled. Then the radio crackled again. Cold, the same voice, but closer, clearer, like it was inside the station. I turned the volume down and tried calling Central Dispatch. The line was dead. No dial tone, no signal. My phone had lost reception too. Just a blinking red X where the bars used. I decided to check the power line. Maybe the storm knocked something out. I suited up, grabbed the flashlight, and headed outside. That's when I saw the footprints. They weren't mine, too small, barefoot, and leading from the edge of the forest toward the station door. But here's the thing. There were only prints coming in, none going back. I followed them for a few feet, but they vanished at the edge of the tree line, just disappeared, as if whoever made them had stepped out of nowhere. When I turned back to the station, something was standing at the window, a pale face, motionless, expressionless, just watching me. I dropped the flashlight and sprinted back inside, heart pounding. But when I reached the door, no one was there. The room was empty, but the air felt colder. I checked the window. No smudges, no condensation, no sign anyone had been there at all. But deep inside, I knew what I saw. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the main room with the emergency lanterns on, staring at the snowstorm outside. Every now and then I'd hear soft creaks in the walls, like footsteps upstairs, but the station had no second floor. Around 3 a.m., I heard the door to the bunk room creak open, slow, deliberate. I stood up, axe in hand, and edged toward the hallway. The door was open, just a crack. Light spilled from the lantern behind me, casting a long shadow into the room. Something was moving in there, not pacing, not rustling, breathing. I slowly pushed the door open with the axe handle. The room was empty, but the window was open, letting in snow and wind. I rushed over to shut it, and that's when I noticed the writing on the frost-covered glass. "Let me in." My hands trembled. I slammed the window shut and backed away, chest tight with panic. I knew then I wasn't alone here. Something was in the station with. I tried to hold out until sunrise, but around 5 a.m., the radio flared to life one last time. "Thank you." Then silence. The air in the room shifted, heavy and cold. The lights flickered once, then came back on. Power restored. The storm began to lift. The signal returned to my phone. Dispatch called, asking for a check-in. I didn't tell them anything. What could I say? I just told them I was fine, shift completed, nothing to report. But when I left the station that morning, I saw something half buried near the base of the building. A small, frost-covered photograph. It was an old image, black and white, of a ranger team from decades ago. And there, in the middle of the group, was the pale-faced figure I saw at the window. His name etched beneath the photo in fading ink. Ranger Elias Kane. Missing 1963. No one ever found his body, and some nights, I wonder if he ever It was the winter after my divorce when I decided to rent a secluded cabin in the mountains for a week of silence and self-reflection. I'd always romanticized solitude, imagined crackling fires, books, hot cocoa, the whole quiet, snowy aesthetic. I found the cabin on a rental web, cozy winter hideaway, perfect for writers and solitude seekers. The photos looked serene, tucked in a thick forest, only reachable by a narrow road that wound through a ravine. Perfect, a place to disappear for a while. I arrived just before a snowstorm rolled. The owner, a quiet man in his 60s, met me at the trailhead to hand off the keys. He seemed rushed and uneasy, like he didn't want to be there any longer than necessary. "You'll have no cell reception," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "The landline works, but sometimes it acts up in bad weather. There's a radio if you really need to call out. It's in the basement." I nodded and thanked him, but as he turned to leave, he paused and added, "If you hear anything strange at night, don't go outside." I laughed, thinking it was a joke. His expression said otherwise. That first night was uneventful. I built a fire, unpacked, and settled in with a book. Snow piled thick outside, and the wind whispered through the trees, peaceful, comforting you. But just after midnight, I heard something. A soft knock at the front door. It wasn't forceful, barely more than a tap. At first, I thought maybe it was a tree branch, but it happened again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. No one. I opened it anyway against my better judgment, and was met with a gust of freezing wind and untouched snow on the porch. Not a single footprint. Nothing. Just the howling storm and the black silhouettes of trees swaying. I went back inside, unsettled. Maybe I'd imagined it. Cabin fever already came. But the knocking returned the same time. Same soft rhythm. This time, I didn't open it. I sat frozen, clutching a blanket around, listening as the knocking to scraping, like fingers dragging slowly across the Then, silent. The next morning, I found a series of tiny handprints in the snow on the porch. Child-size. Dozens of. No tracks leading to or from them, just scattered little hands pressed into the snow, as if something had crouched there for hours, watching me from just outside. I thought about leaving, but the snowstorm had gotten worse. The road out was completely blocked. The landline was dead. No cell signal. I tried the basement radio, but it wouldn't power on. Just static and hissing. That night, it wasn't just the front door. There were knocks on the windows, on the walls, the roof. Every few minutes, a new sound. Thumps, dragging noises, soft whispers I couldn't make out. I tried drowning it out with music, but the power flickered and died around 2 a.m. The cabin was swallowed in total darkness. I curled up by the fireplace, clutching a flashlight and staring at the front door, waiting for it to swing open. It didn't. But just before dawn, I swear I saw something in the window. Something crouched low, peeking in. Eyes too wide. A face too pale. Mouth opened far too wide for a human jaw. And it smiled. When I ran outside in the morning light, it was gone. The snow was clean again. No handprints, no sign of anything. But there were scratches on the door. Deep, claw-like gouges from the inside. I couldn't stay another night. I started digging a path through the snow, desperate to get back to the main road. I walked for hours, freezing, exhausted, and that's when I saw it. Another cabin, identical to mine. Same porch, same firewood pile, same window layout. I stood frozen, staring at it in disbelief. I knew there was only one cabin on this trail. The owner had said so, but there it was. Another version of my rental, just sitting deeper in the forest, half buried in snow, and there was someone in the window, staring at me. I turned and ran back toward my cabin, but the woods suddenly felt wrong. Paths I hadn't seen before, trees that seemed unfamiliar, like I had wandered into a different forest entirely. When I finally made it back, it was already dark. I stayed by the fire again, shaking, trying to convince myself I'd hallucinated the second cabin. But just after midnight, the knocking came again. Only this time, it came from inside the house. I turned slowly and saw the basement door wide open. I hadn't touched it since trying the radio. Cold air seeped from below. The knocking continued, soft, deliberate, echoing up from the bottom of the stairs. Then I heard something climb, something that dragged its limbs, scraping against the steps, whispering between clicks and gurgles. I didn't stay. I ran barefoot through the snow, back to the trail, without coat or light. I didn't stop running until I saw headlights. A snowplow driver found me near the highway, half frozen and hysterical. They took me to the nearest hospital. When I told the owner what happened, he just sighed. Said others had reported strange things before. No one ever stayed more than a couple nights. Said he tried to take the listing down, but it kept reappearing online on its own, like something wanted people to keep coming. I still don't know what was in that cabin, but sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I hear those slow knocks, 3 at a time. And sometimes, when I walk past a window, I swear I catch a reflection that isn't mine, just a pale face, grinning from behind the glass. I used to work as a delivery driver for a small local grocery store just outside a remote mountain town. It was mostly routine stuff, drop-offs to regulars, even during storms. People depended on us, especially the ones who lived far from the main roads. Most of the folks I delivered to were kind, if a little quirky. But there was one house, just one, that always made me uneasy. It sat deep in the woods, a crooked, slanted structure, barely visible from the winding road. Locals called it the Marlowe House, though no one really knew who lived there anymore. My boss told me the orders came in regularly, paid in cash, left in a rusted tin box, nailed to the porch. I never saw anyone, never heard a voice, just a single order slip and money in that box every Friday. I always dreaded that stop. Something about that place felt off. The way the trees leaned too close to it, the way the windows looked like eyes, the way it was always colder near the porch, like the warmth of the world didn't reach that property. One Friday evening, a snowstorm started brewing. I had 2 deliveries left, one in town, then the Marlowe house. I considered skipping it, but I knew my boss would ask questions, and besides, I just wanted to get it over with. I loaded the last crate of groceries into the truck and made the drive. The road was getting dangerous. Wind howled through the trees and snowflakes swirled like ash in headlights. I took it slow, tires crunching over ice and slush. By the time I reached the Marlowe house, it was already full dark, the storm thickening like a curtain around me. I parked and stepped out, groceries in hand, my boots sinking into fresh snow. The porch light flickered above me, dim and yellow, casting weird shadows on the warped boards. The tin box was there, just like always. I placed the groceries down and opened the lid. But this time, there was no money, no order slip, just a note written in thick, shaky letters. "You shouldn't have come tonight." I froze. The wind howled louder as if in response. I turned around, scanning the trees, half expecting someone to step out from the woods. Then I heard it, footsteps on the porch, but not mine. These were lighter, faster. I spun back toward the house, and the groceries I'd just set down were gone. I didn't hear the door open, didn't see it move. They'd just vanished. I stood there for a moment, unsure if I'd imagined it. My heart hammered in my chest, and my breath came out in clouds. Then something thumped from inside the house, a heavy sound like something being dropped, followed by another, and another. I stepped back, preparing to run. But the porch light flickered again, and for a brief second I saw something in the window. A shape. No, several. Faces, pale and crooked, pressed up against the glass from the inside. Mouths slightly open, eyes wide and sunken. None of them moved, just stared. I bolted to the truck, slipped in the snow, scrambled back up, and dove into the driver's seat. I turned the key. The engine didn't start. It whined, then sputtered, then died completely. My breath fogged up the windshield, and I could see them still, the faces in the window. But now, one was gone. I heard something tap the truck's side mirror. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what it was, but some awful part of me had to. A hand was pressed against the mirror, long fingers, thin and pale, nails blackened like ash. It slowly slid down the glass, making a screeching sound. Then, the door handle started moving. I locked the doors just in time. I sat there, frozen, watching those faces slowly return to the window one by one. Except now they were smiling, wide, unblinking grins that stretched unnaturally across their faces. The porch light went out, and everything went silent. Eventually, the engine kicked back to life, sputtering but alive. I didn't wait. I hit the gas and sped down that icy road, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. When I finally made it back to town, I told my boss I was done delivering. He didn't argue, just gave me a tired nod. "They always quit after a while," he said softly. "I don't know who or what lives in the Marlowe house. I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I'm driving at night, I see things in the corner of my headlights, pale shapes darting behind trees. And once, just once, I passed a broken-down car on the side of the road near the wood. No driver, no footprints, just an open door, and a note fluttering in the snow. 'You shouldn't have come tonight.'" I was never afraid of the snow. Growing up in the northern hills, snowstorms were just a part of life. White blankets muffling the world into a quiet, frozen calm. I used to find it peaceful, almost sacred. But that was before last winter, before I saw something in the snow that changed everything I thought I knew about what lurks in the cold. It started after I took a temporary caretaker job for a remote mountain lodge during the off-season. The owner, an elderly woman named Ms. Fairweather, was traveling abroad and needed someone to watch the property through the worst of winter. She told me I'd be completely alone. No guests, no deliveries, no visitors. Just keep the place warm, check the pipes, and shovel the walkways. I was thrilled. A whole lodge to myself, free food, beautiful views, and no distractions. It sounded perfect. For the first 2 weeks it was. I kept the fires going, read books by the massive stone fireplace, and watched storms roll in through floor-to-ceiling windows. The isolation felt soothing, healing even. But then, during one particularly heavy snowstorm, something strange happened. I noticed footprints. Not mine. They started near the tree line at the edge of the property and led right up to the front porch. Bare footprints. No boots, no shoes. Just naked feet pressed into the snow. Small and narrow, toes splayed like a child's. But there were no children for miles. The nearest neighbor was almost 10 kilometers away. I stared out at the prints for a long time, trying to make sense of them. I even stepped outside to double check, but the storm had wiped out most details, except the deep impressions. I chalked it up to some weird wind pattern or an animal track warped by the weather. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, the lodge groaned more than usual. Wind howled down the chimney, and I swore I heard soft tapping on the second-floor windows. I ignored it at first. Then, the power went out. I grabbed my flashlight and headed to the basement to check the breaker. That's when I heard the creaking on the stairs above me. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming down from the second floor. I held my breath, waiting. Nothing. When I climbed back up, flashlight trembling in my hand, every door upstairs was wide open, even the ones I kept locked. Cold air leaked into every hallway, and I found tiny wet footprints on the floor, as if someone had come in from the snow barefoot and walked through the house. I searched everywhere, every room, every closet, but there was no one. That's when the knocking started again. This time it came from inside the walls. At first it was faint, like a rat scurrying, but then it grew louder. A pattern, 3 knocks, pause, 3 more. Then it began to shift, moving from wall to wall, from floor to ceiling, as if something was crawling through the very bones of the lodge. I didn't sleep that night. The next day I noticed something else. Handprints on the inside of the windows, smeared and distorted like someone had pressed their face and palms against the glass. Watching me sleep, I tried calling out on the radio. No response. The landline was dead. The snowstorm had intensified, making it impossible to leave even if I wanted to. I was trapped. The following nights became a blur of whispers, movement, and fear. I'd hear laughter in the vents, a child's laugh, hollow and echoing, followed by sobbing. Doors slammed shut on their own. Shadows flickered in rooms I wasn't in. Sometimes I'd wake up with frostbite-like burns on my arms and neck, even though the fireplace burned all night. Then came the worst night. I woke up to find someone standing at the foot of my bed, a small figure shrouded in wet clothes, head tilted unnaturally sideways. I couldn't see their face, just dark matted hair and the glint of eyes that didn't blink. I couldn't move. They reached out with a hand, long, bony fingers with cracked nails, and touched my forehead. The moment they did, my body snapped back to life. I lunged up, screamed, and the figure vanished in a blink. I packed everything the next morning and prepared to leave on foot, storm or not. But when I opened the front door, the snow was gone, completely melted around the lodge, as if spring had come in a single night. No footprints, no storm, just silence. Miss Fairweather returned the next day, earlier than expected. I tried to explain what happened. She didn't even flinch. "Oh," she said calmly, as if I'd told her the stove wasn't working. "The lodge does that sometimes in winter. It's why no one stays past 2 weeks. I thought you'd leave sooner, honestly." "What does that?" I asked, shaken. She just smiled faintly. "The snow keeps them near the surface," she said. "When it melts, they go back down." "They?" She didn't answer. I left without another word. I've never returned to that mountain town. But every time it snows heavily near my new home, I wake up in the middle of the night and check my windows, just in case. And sometimes I swear I still hear faint knocking from inside the walls. I never thought my final winter break from college would scar me for life. I just wanted peace and quiet, away from the chaos of dorms, deadlines, and noise. So when my cousin Liam offered me his family's cabin deep in the snowy hills of Montana, I jumped at the chance. It was remote, cozy, and completely off-grid. Just me, a wood stove, a generator, and the silence of untouched snow. That kind of isolation sounded like paradise. I wish I could go back in time and tell myself not to go. The drive up took longer than expected. A snowstorm had started by the time I reached the narrow road leading to the cabin. Trees closed in on both sides, and the wind howled like it carried voices, but I finally made it. The cabin was perfect. A little 2-story wooden home, surrounded by nothing but wilderness. No neighbors for miles. The first 2 days were peaceful. I spent my time reading, drinking coffee by the fire, and going on short hikes through the woods. I kept a path shoveled to the outhouse, and at night, I'd stare out into the darkness, marveling at how black the woods became under the weight of a storm. But on the third night, something changed. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a strange sound, a faint humming, low and rhythmic, like someone humming a lullaby just outside the window. I sat up, heart already pounding, and listened. It stopped the moment I moved. I went to the window and saw nothing, just snow and trees swaying in the wind. But the unease stayed with me. The next morning, I found something buried in the snow near the outhouse. A small wooden figurine, crude, handmade, a little figure with long arms and a slit where the mouth should be. It was buried deep, like it had been there a while. I assumed it was something Liam left behind, maybe a childhood craft, and tossed it aside. But that night, the humming returned. This time, closer. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, determined to figure out what was going on. The wind was brutal, cutting through my jacket, and the snow was waist-deep in places. But I kept going, circling the cabin slowly. Nothing. No footprints. No signs of anyone or anything. Just that sound again. Humming. Distant now. Drifting between the trees like it was circling. When I got back inside, the wooden figure I'd discarded earlier was sitting on the doorstep. I didn't put it there. The next few nights were worse. I'd hear footsteps crunching in the snow, whispers through the walls, soft knocks on the cabin's exterior at random hours. Once, I swore I heard something breathing on the other side of the door, slow and heavy, like it was waiting for me to open it. On the fifth night, I woke up to the sound of the front door creaking open. I bolted upright, heart pounding, and grabbed the axe I'd kept beside the bed. When I reached the living room, the door was swinging gently, wide open to the storm. Snow had started piling inside, but there were no footprints leading in or out, just a trail of water, like something had dragged itself in and vanished. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and didn't sleep the rest of the I kept hearing that humming again. Only this time, it was inside the house, moving room to room, like something was searching for me. At dawn, I made the decision to leave. I packed my bags, threw everything into the truck, and started the engine. But before I could pull away, I noticed something in the rearview mirror, a shape standing at the edge of the trees, tall and thin, wearing what looked like a cloak of frost. I couldn't see its face, just long, stick-like arms and a twisted posture, like its bones didn't bend the right way. It didn't move, it didn't come any closer. But as I reversed down the snowy path, it lifted a hand and pointed at me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. When I reached the nearest town, I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was stress, isolation, too many horror stories in my head. But the next day, I got a call from Liam. "You left the figure outside," he said, sounding annoyed. "I told you not to disturb anything around the cabin." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "There's a story around that," he said. "Locals say something wanders through those woods in winter. They leave those figures near homes to warn it away. If you move them, it notices you." "What happens if it notices?" He went quiet for a moment. "Then it follows you." It's been months since that trip. I've moved apartments, changed cities, but I still hear it sometimes, faintly at night, the humming. I find melted snow patches in my hallway, even when I haven't opened a window. I wake up to footprints outside my door, though no one's ever there. And last week I found that same wooden figure on my windowsill. It's here. It's waiting. It was supposed to be a quick supply run. That's what I told myself when I left the ranger station that morning. I'd been stationed at a remote forest outpost for a winter wildlife observation program, part of a solo research project I had volunteered for. Weeks of isolation didn't bother me. I liked the quiet, the endless snowfall, the crackle of the fireplace, the gentle rustling of wind through the pine trees. It was all soothing until that day. I'd run out of some essentials, batteries, canned goods, and fuel for the generator. The main supply depot was about 20 miles down the mountain, and the sky was clear when I set off on the snowmobile. I figured I'd be there and back before nightfall. But halfway back, the storm rolled in, fast, angry, and suffocating. Snow slammed down in thick sheets, and visibility dropped to nothing. I couldn't see the trees anymore, couldn't tell which direction I was going. The trail was gone, buried under white, and before I could even think of turning around, the engine sputtered and died. I was stranded. I wrapped my scarf tighter and tried to radio the station. Nothing but static. No signal, no bearings. Just me in the blinding, shrieking cold. I knew I couldn't stay out in the open. Hypothermia would kill me before morning. So I started walking, dragging my supplies behind me, hoping I'd somehow circle back to the trail or find a tree shelter. That's when I saw it. A faint shape in the white, like a structure, a cabin. Didn't make sense. There wasn't supposed to be anything out here. No other buildings for miles. But there it was. A squat wooden cabin half buried in snow. Smoke, rising weakly from the chimney. I should have questioned it more, but the cold was already gnawing at my fingers. I approached, knocked, and when no one answered, I pushed the door open. The warmth hit me immediately. A fire crackled in the stone hearth. Oil lamps lit the space with a flickering yellow glow. The furniture was old but clean. Rocking chair, small table, a bookshelf full of dust-covered tomes, but no one was inside. Still, I told myself someone must live here. Maybe they just stepped out. I sat by the fire, thawing my hands, listening to the wind outside. I figured I'd wait a bit, leave a note, then try the trail again once the storm eased. But hours passed. No one came. And then the unease crept in. I began to notice things, odd things. There was no coat by the door, no boots, no signs of food or use in the kitchen. But the fire was fresh. The lamps were lit. A steaming mug of tea sat on the table, untouched, as if the owner had vanished seconds before I arrived. And then the whispering started. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was inside the cabin, subtle and serpentine, curling through the room like a draft, faint voices murmuring in a language I didn't recognize. I searched every corner of the cabin, nothing. No attic, no basement, no hiding place. Just a trapdoor under the rug. I hadn't noticed it before. The handle was iron, half rusted and cold to the touch. Something about it made my stomach twist, but the whispers were louder now, coming from beneath it. I hesitated, then pried it open. A black void stared back at me. Stairs descended into the darkness, far deeper than the cabin should allow. I stood there, heart pounding, listening. Something was breathing. I slammed the trapdoor shut and dragged a chair over it. I tried to leave, but when I opened the front door, there was no storm. No snow, just complete darkness. No trees, no sky, no ground. It was like stepping into a void, like the world had disappeared beyond the threshold. I slammed the door again and backed away. That's when I saw the writing on the wall. It hadn't been. Scrawled in some black, oily substance were the words, "You shouldn't have come in." I turned around and saw the tea mug now shattered on the floor. The fire had gone out and the oil lamps dimmed one by one, until only shadows remained. Something moved across the ceiling, a spindly shape, too fast to catch clearly. I grabbed my backpack, ready to run, but the cabin had changed. The door led to a wall now. The windows were bricked over. I wasn't in a cabin anymore. I was in a box, trapped. The whispers turned to screams, overlapping voices in agony, repeating phrases I couldn't understand. The floor beneath me began to shake, and the trapdoor snapped open violently. I saw eyes down there, dozens of them, staring up at me. Then came the hands, thin, elongated fingers, reaching, pulling, grasping at the floorboards, the walls, me. I blacked out. When I woke up, I was lying in the snow, 20 feet from my rangers. There was no storm, no trail, no cabin. Just my backpack beside me and a note tucked inside it. A torn scrap of old paper. 4 words, scrawled in shaky handwriting, "Don't ever go back." But the worst part? The next morning, I found a second trapdoor under the floorboards of the ranger station, one that hadn't been there before. And sometimes at night, I swear I still hear whispers rising from beneath it. I never thought a simple detour would lead me into something so sinister. It was supposed to be a scenic route, just a slower road winding through the snowy hills before reconnecting to the main highway. I was driving home after visiting my parents for the holidays, craving solitude and silence, the kind you can only find on a snowy winter road, far from traffic and noise. The snow had started falling lightly when I turned onto the old county road. Trees arched over the pavement, heavy with frost, and the silence was thick and serene. It felt peaceful at first, but that feeling didn't last. After about 30 minutes, I realized I hadn't seen another car since turning off the main road. No tire tracks, no headlights behind me, nothing. Just me, the snow, and an endless stretch of icy pavement. Then, the storm rolled in hard. Thick, blinding flakes, winds strong enough to rattle the frame of my car. I slowed to a crawl, headlights barely cutting through the whiteout. And that's when I saw it, a figure on the side of the road. I almost missed it. A tall man standing still in the snow, wearing a tattered coat and no hat. No car nearby, no footprints behind him. Just him, standing alone in the storm with his back to me. I slowed, rolled down my window slightly, and called out, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" He didn't respond, didn't even flinch. I was about to drive off when he turned around, slowly, deliberately, and I froze. His face was pale, too pale, almost gray. His eyes were wide, glassy, and unnaturally dark. His mouth was open slightly, like he was trying to speak but couldn't form the word. Something about him felt wrong, like his skin didn't fit quite right or his joints weren't bending the way they should. I panicked and drove off, tires skidding on the icy road. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, but he didn't move, just stood there, watching. A few minutes later, I passed a small wooden sign half buried in the snow. "Welcome to Hollow Creek." That name didn't sound familiar. I didn't remember it being on the map, But the road had become worse, too narrow to turn around. So I kept going, thinking it would eventually connect back to the highway. Then I started seeing the same man again, first at a bend in the road, then again 5 minutes later, standing near an old telephone pole. Same tattered coat, same frozen stare. It was impossible. He couldn't have walked that fast, especially in a storm like this. But every few miles, there he was, always watching. The road led into a small town, or what looked like one. Wooden buildings, cracked signs, old street lamps swaying in the wind. Not a single light on, not a single person in sight. The entire town was silent, dead. I slowed as I passed through the main street. Every storefront was boarded up. Snow had piled up in unnatural ways, like no one had disturbed it in years. But I could still see shadows and shapes moving slowly behind the dusty glass, peering out at me. Then my engine sputtered and died, just like that. I turned the key over and over again. Nothing, no sound, no power. I sat in the dead silence, my breath fogging up the windshield. That's when I noticed movement in my side mirror. The man was walking toward my car. This time I could see him clearly. His face was decaying, flakes of skin peeling away, eyes dark and sunken. And behind him, I saw more figures, dozens, all walking slowly, silently, from between the buildings, from alleyways, from behind fences, all of them pale, twisted, and broken. I locked the doors, but I knew it wouldn't matter. They stopped just a few feet from the car and stood still, surrounding it, staring. One of them raised a hand and pointed to a building on the corner, a crumbling old church with its doors wide open. I didn't want to get out. I didn't want to go anywhere, but something inside me started to feel off, like I wasn't in control of my body anymore. Like the cold had seeped into my bones and something else was steering me. I got out and walked toward the church. Inside, it was pitch black, but as I stepped through the threshold, the doors slammed shut behind me. Candles flickered to life on their own. Rows of pews lined the room, and every one of them was filled with those same dead-eyed figures, just sitting, waiting. There was a pulpit at the front, and behind it stood a woman. Her skin was porcelain smooth, but her mouth stretched too wide, and her fingers were thin like icicles. She smiled at me and said in a voice that didn't match her face, "You've arrived late. I don't belong here," I whispered. She nodded slowly. "Not yet, but you will." I don't remember what happened after that. I just remember waking up in my car again, miles away from Hollow Creek. The engine was running. The storm had passed. The road was empty. I thought maybe I imagined it. Maybe I'd hallucinated from the cold. But then I checked my phone. There were photos in my gallery I didn't take. Blurry images of the church, the figures in the pews, the pale woman at the pulpit staring into the camera. One image was a close-up of asleep in the car, taken from outside the window. And the last photo? It was of my reflection, except my eyes weren't mine anymore. They were sunken, black, and lifeless. I've never told anyone this story before, not because I didn't want to, but because I honestly didn't think anyone would believe me. Even now, retelling it makes me feel like I'm peeling back the edge of something that should have stayed buried. But if I don't say it out loud, it'll just keep festering inside me. It happened 2 years ago during what was supposed to be a relaxing winter getaway. I'd booked a remote mountain lodge through one of those vacation rental apps. It was a quaint little cabin tucked deep into the forest, advertised as off-grid luxury. I needed the break. City life was suffocating, and my therapist said solitude would help with my insomnia. The snow had already started falling by the time I arrived. The drive up was slow, winding, and unnerving, but I managed to reach the cabin just before nightfall. It was even more beautiful than the pictures. Dark wooden walls, a stone fireplace, massive windows overlooking the pine-covered valley. But what the listing didn't mention was how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, just dead quiet, like the kind of silence that presses against your ears until it starts to sound like something is breathing just beyond the walls. The first night passed, uneventfully. I lit a fire, made a cup of tea, and curled up with a book. I almost convinced myself this trip would actually help me relax. But on the second night, things shifted. It started with a sound, just a faint scraping like nails on wood. I thought it might be an animal outside, so I ignored it. Then came the footsteps, not on the ground, but above me, in the attic. Heavy, deliberate, and slow. There was no attic listed in the cabin description. I checked the layout before I came. It was a single-story lodge. Still, I grabbed a flashlight and looked around. In the hallway above a narrow closet, I found a square panel in the ceiling. It was a pull-down attic hatch, slightly ajar. I don't know how I hadn't noticed it before. I should have left right then. But curiosity got the better of me. I pulled the hatch open, and a rickety wooden ladder creaked down. The moment I poked my head up, I felt a rush of cold air, far colder than the rest of the cabin. My flashlight flickered as I scanned the small space. It was empty, at first, but then I saw them. Carvings all over the beams and walls, Strange symbols, spirals, runes I didn't recognize. Some looked old, others freshly scratched in. One phrase kept repeating over and over. He watches where warmth hides. I climbed down quickly and closed the hatch. The air in the cabin suddenly felt thinner. My skin prickled and a cold sweat ran down my back. That night I barely slept. Every time I started to drift off, I heard whispers. Not words exactly, the shape of a voice, like breathless murmuring from the walls themselves. On the third night, the firewood wouldn't catch. No matter how many times I tried, the flames wouldn't last more than a few minutes. The temperature dropped rapidly, and I noticed frost forming on the inside of the windows, thick spider-like patterns that pulsed subtly as if moving. I was about to gather my things and leave when I noticed something even stranger, the reflection in the window. I was standing in the middle of the room, but the reflection showed me still sitting on the couch, staring into the fire. It took me a second to realize I wasn't looking at myself. I was looking at something wearing my face, but not quite right. The eyes were too dark. The expression was too still. It just sat there, watching me, and then it smiled. But I hadn't smiled. I turned away instantly, heart racing. When I looked back, it was gone. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I had frostbite starting on my fingers, despite wearing gloves, and every object in the cabin was ice cold to the touch. My breath lingered in the air like smoke, even next to the stove. I tried to start the car. The engine wouldn't turn over. My phone had died during the night. I was completely trapped. The whispering returned louder that evening, no longer subtle. It came from the fireplace, from the vents, from inside the walls. And this time, it wasn't just whispering. It was chanting, the same phrase I saw in the attic. He watches where warmth hides. Then came the knocking, soft, rhythmic, like someone tapping on every door and window, in a perfect circle around the cabin. The sound never stopped. I covered my ears, curled up in a corner, and tried to pretend I wasn't hearing it. At some point, the door blew open, just wide enough for the cold to creep in. I ran to close it, but when I looked out, there was a figure standing at the edge of the woods, tall, pale, wrapped in a tattered cloak made of something that shimmered like frost-covered skin. I couldn't see his face, just an outline, crowned with twisted antlers made of ice. He didn't move, just stood there in the storm, watching. I slammed the door and didn't open it again until daylight. When morning came, the snow had stopped, the sun had risen, and everything felt normal again. My phone was working. The car started. Even the firewood caught flame instantly. It was as if the cabin had never changed, but something was different about it. Even now, weeks later, I can still see my reflection smiling back when I'm not. And sometimes, when I light a fire, I hear a low whisper in the crackling flames, reminding me, he watches where warmth hides. I had always loved Snowstorm. There was something comforting about being wrapped in a blanket, while the world outside turned into a frozen white void. So when my friend Caleb invited me to his late uncle's cabin for a weekend getaway during a heavy winter storm, I didn't hesitate. A few beers, some card games, maybe a horror movie or two. It sounded perfect, isolated, cozy, and far from our stressful day jobs. There were 5 of us: me, Caleb, his girlfriend Jessa, our friend Nate, and his younger cousin Lucas. The cabin sat deep in the forest, about 10 miles off the nearest main road, nestled on a ridge that overlooked a frozen lake. It was rustic but beautiful, with towering pine trees and a fire pit buried under layers of snow. We arrived just before the storm really hit, and by nightfall, the wind howled so loud it sounded like voices screaming through the woods. The first night was uneventful. We played board games, drank cheap whiskey, and joked about being characters in a horror movie. It was fun, the kind of bonding we all needed. But that night, something odd happened. I woke up to the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow outside my window. At first, I figured it was one of the others taking a walk or grabbing firewood. But when I looked outside, all I saw was the snow swirling violently in the wind and a single set of footprints leading from the forest to the cabin. Just one set. No return path. I checked the door. Locked. Everyone was asleep. I tried to ignore it and went back to bed, telling myself I was being paranoid. The next morning, Caleb noticed the prints too. He tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably just a deer trail that had shifted in the wind. But these were boot prints, human, deep, deliberate steps. That day, the storm intensified. We lost power around noon. No heat, no lights, no phone signal. We gathered in the living room and lit candles, wrapped ourselves in blankets, and kept the fireplace going. We tried to make it fun, telling ghost stories, playing word games, but a strange tension had settled in. Something was off. That night, Lucas went missing. We searched the entire cabin, screaming his name, thinking maybe he'd gone outside to use the outhouse. But there were no new footprints in the snow, not a single trail leading away from the cabin. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. We were terrified. We stayed together the rest of the night, sitting in a tight circle near the fireplace, barely speaking, but something was watching us. I could feel it. Every flicker of candlelight cast shadows that twisted and curled unnaturally along the walls. Around 3 a.m., that Nate pointed toward the window. His voice cracked when he said, "Look." There, in the snow just a few feet from the cabin, was Lucas, or something that looked like him. He was standing barefoot, shirtless, eyes wide and blank. He didn't move, didn't shiver, just stood there, staring at it. We rushed to open the door, but Caleb stopped us. "That's not him," he said, backing away. "Something's wrong. Look at his face," and he was right. Lucas's skin was turning blue, his lips cracked, and his arms hung loosely at his sides, like they didn't belong to him anymore. He looked hollow, empty, and still, he didn't move, not even when we called his name. Eventually, the figure turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing behind the trees. That night, none of us slept. We kept hearing footsteps circling the cabin, faint taps on the windows, and once a low, wet scraping sound on the walls, like something dragging a heavy body through the snow. The next morning, Jessa was gone. Her blanket was on the couch, still warm. No broken windows, no signs of a struggle. Just like Lucas, gone without a trace, as if the cabin was swallowing us one by one. Nate completely broke down. He kept repeating, "This place isn't right. There's something under the snow." He started digging outside in a frenzy, bare hands clawing at the frozen ground until they bled. We had to drag him back inside. That night, it was Caleb who heard the whispers first. He said it was Jessa's voice calling his name, begging for help. But when he opened the door, we saw nothing, just more snow, more silence. Then he ran into the woods, convinced she was out there. We waited for him to come back. He never did. By morning, only Nate and I were left. We decided to make a run for it, storm or not. We packed what we could and started walking through the deep snow, following the road back toward town. We didn't speak, just kept our heads down and pushed forward. Then we saw them. Dozens of figures in the distance, barely visible through the blizzard, all standing still, all watching. And as we got closer, we realized they weren't moving because they weren't alive anymore. They were frozen solid, figures that looked just like our friends, like echoes of what used to be people, standing in the storm, mouths open as if caught mid-scream. Nate lost it. He screamed and ran ahead. I didn't follow. I turned and ran in the opposite direction, through the trees, through the snow, until I collapsed from exhaustion. I woke up in a hospital. A truck driver found me on the side of the road, miles from the cabin. They said I had severe frostbite and hypothermia. When I asked about the others, no bodies were ever, not even the cabin. The authorities said there was no listing under the name Caleb gave. No cabin, no lodge, no road by that name in the registry. It was like the entire place had vanished. But I still see them in my dreams. My friends standing in the snow, mouths open in that same silent scream. And sometimes, when it's cold enough, I hear footsteps just outside my door, still circling, still watching. It's been years since I moved to the countryside, hoping to escape the noise and chaos of city life. The small, secluded town offered a slower pace, quiet nights, and an untouched beauty in winter. I bought a modest house near a dense woodland trail where the snow would fall thick and heavy, blanketing everything in silence. The locals warned me about the storms here, that the wind could howl like wolves, and the cold could bite like teeth. But I was prepared, or so I thought. The snowstorm that began one January evening was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just the amount of snow, it was the stillness that came with it. A strange, eerie silence blanketed the town. No wind, no birds, no cars. Just a stillness so profound, it made my ears ring. I was alone in my house that night, watching the snowfall from my window, with a cup of tea when I first noticed it. A figure at the edge of the woods, standing completely still. At first I assumed it was a hunter or a lost hiker, but they didn't move, not for minutes, not even when the snowfall thickened and covered them halfway to the... I squinted, trying to make out the details, but the figure remained blurred, tall, unmoving, and eerily still. I turned away for a moment to grab my flashlight, but when I looked back, they were gone. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the snow and shadow, but something about it gnawed at me. Later that night, just before I went to bed, I heard knocking at the front door. Not pounding, just 3 soft, deliberate taps. I froze. No one would be out in a storm like this, especially not in this part of town. I peeked through the peephole. No one was there. But when I opened the door to check, there were footprints in the snow, leading up to my porch, and none leading away. I shut the door and locked every window in the house. Around 3 a.m., I was awakened by a strange whispering sound, like voices speaking through the floorboards. I followed the sound to my basement door. I hadn't used the basement much. It was mostly storage. But that night, the whispering grew louder. like hushed voices echoing from beneath the ground. I opened the door, and the cold that came from below was not just winter cold. It was unnatural, bitter, heavy, almost wet. I shone my flashlight down the steps, and something caught my eye at the far end of the basement, a pile of snow in the middle of the floor. Snow? Inside? I stepped down slowly, heart pounding, and that's when I saw it. Footprints in the snow, forming a perfect circle around the pile. As I got closer, I noticed something sticking out from the snow. A hand, frostbitten, fingers curled unnaturally. I stumbled back, ran upstairs, and called the police. They came hours later once the storm died down. But when they checked the basement, there was nothing there. No snow, no hand, no footprints. Just a damp spot on the concrete floor. They looked at me like I was insane. That day, I drove into town to speak with one of the older locals, a man named Barrett, who owned the general store. When I told him what I saw, his face went pale. "You've seen the Winter Watcher," he said grimly. "It waits at the edge of the woods when a storm gets bad. It watches homes, knocks on doors, whispers beneath your floor, and when it chooses someone, they vanish." I asked him how long this had been happening. He said it's been around longer than anyone remembers. Some say it's a spirit, others say it's a remnant of something buried deep in the forest, a guardian of something ancient, angry, disturbed. Whatever it is, he never invited in, and never answer its knock. That night I heard the knocking again, 3 soft taps, then again louder, this time from the back door. I didn't move. I sat in my chair, staring at the door, clutching a fire poker. Then the whispering began again. Only this time, it wasn't from the basement. It was coming from inside the walls. Every room I entered, I could hear faint whispers behind the drywall. I could barely make out the words, but it sounded like my own voice, repeating things I'd said earlier that, like an echo trapped and twisted. I didn't sleep that night, and I didn't. Each night the knocking continued, on doors, on windows, even from beneath the floor. I began to see shadows standing outside my house, figures etched in frost on the glass, faces pressed against the windows, only to vanish when I blinked. And then one morning, I found a trail of wet, melting footprints inside my living room, leading from the back door to the basement. I knew I never opened that. The last thing I remember before blacking out was a cold hand gripping my shoulder from behind. When I woke up, I was lying in the snow outside my house. The front door was wide open. All my furniture had been rearranged, symbols carved into the walls, windows broken from the inside, and my basement door gone, as if it had never existed. I moved away after that. But even now, years later, when it snows hard and the world goes still, I hear 3 soft knocks on my door. I never answer them. I never look outside, because I know it's still watching, waiting. It was a harsh winter, one of the worst the town had seen in decades. I remember it vividly, not because of the record snowfall or the biting cold, but because of what happened during that storm. I've never told anyone the full story, not my wife, not my kids, but it's been gnawing at me for too long. And now, every time the snow begins to fall, I feel it watching again. I was working as a maintenance man at an old ski lodge about 30 miles from town, tucked deep into the mountains. The place had seen better days. Wooden beams creaked with age, the heating system sputtered on its last breath, and some rooms hadn't been renovated since the 70s. But it had charm, and the regular guests loved the quiet isolation. That winter, we had a full booking for the holidays. Families, couples, a few solo travelers. Everything was running smoothly until the blizzard rolled in. At first, it was just heavy snowfall, but by nightfall, it became something else. The wind was vicious, hurling snow sideways, and the power flickered constantly. The guests were uneasy, but I kept busy checking the generators and making rounds with my flashlight. That's when I noticed something strange. The snow near the back entrance was disturbed, a trail of deep footprints leading away from the building, toward the woods. No one should have been outside, especially not in that kind of weather. I followed the trail for a bit, but it vanished at the edge of the tree line, like the person had simply disappeared. I came back inside, chilled to the bone, and told myself it was nothing. Maybe a guest had stepped outside and turned back. But when I checked the guest logs and room keys, every guest was accounted for. That night, around midnight, one of the guests came to the front desk, pale and shaken. She said there was someone standing outside her window. Her room was on the 3rd floor. I rushed upstairs with her and checked. There were no footprints in the snow beneath the window, no ladders, nothing. I checked the fire escape and even the roof, but found nothing. She insisted she saw someone, tall, thin, and staring with eyes that didn't blink. Later that night, I did another patrol. I reached the West Wing hallway, mostly empty rooms, and noticed something off. The temperature dropped drastically in that section. My breath came out in thick puffs, even though the heaters were running fine elsewhere. Then I heard it, whispering, soft at first, then louder. It wasn't coming from a room, it was coming from the air vent. I bent down and listened closely, and I swear, I heard voices calling my name. I checked the utility room, thinking maybe the pipes were rattling again, but the whispers followed me, and then came the knocking. 3 knocks, slow and rhythmic, on the utility door. I opened it immediately. No one was there, but footprints in the snow had appeared inside the room, wet and melting on the concrete floor. They led from the door straight into the boiler room, but there was no one inside. The next morning, a family reported their child missing. The entire staff began searching, inside, outside, every floor. We eventually found her near the old storage cabin out back, huddled in the snow, mumbling incoherently. She was in shock, barely responsive, and her skin was frostbitten. When she finally started speaking again, she said someone had called her name from the hallway. She followed the voice, thinking it was her mom, but it wasn't. She said she saw a woman with a face like cracked porcelain and empty black eyes, standing near the back exit. The woman beckoned her toward the woods, and she followed until she lost her way. After that, everything spiraled out of control. Guests began reporting nightmares. Everyone described the same figure in their dreams, a faceless woman standing at their door, whispering through the crack, trying to be let in. One guest woke up with frost on the inside of his window and a handprint etched into the glass. Another said she heard footsteps walking around her bed all night, though no one was there. Even the staff began experiencing things. My coworker Josh found a snow-covered handprint on the inside of the fridge door. Another saw the silhouette of a woman standing behind him in the reflection of the microwave, though no one was there when he turned. I tried to keep everyone calm, but I was losing control. The storm had cut us off entirely. No roads were passable, no signals for phones, and the lodge's radio system stopped working mysteriously. One night, I was walking through the service tunnel that connected the storage cabin to the main lodge, a narrow, cold corridor, barely lit by flickering bulbs, when I saw her. She was just standing at the far end, half shrouded in shadow, her white dress swaying despite the still air. Her face was as the child described, porcelain-like, fractured, expressionless. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was stare. Then, in a voice colder than the snowstorm outside, she whispered, "Let me in!" The lights flickered and she was gone. The storm ended 2 days later. The roads reopened, guests left, and everything returned to normal, almost. But we found something disturbing when the snow began to melt. Behind the storage cabin, buried beneath the ice, and we found bones, old, brittle, and bound in tattered remnants of a white dress. No one ever figured out who she was or how long those remains had been there. But I know. I feel her still in every gust of wind, in every snowflake that hits my window. I left that job soon after, moved somewhere warm, far from the mountains, far from the snow. But every year when winter comes again, I hear her voice, "Let me." It was supposed to be a quick delivery, one last package before I could head home and ride out the snowstorm from the comfort of my apartment. I worked for a small courier service in a remote mountain town, and winter deliveries were always unpredictable. Still, I'd handled work. That evening, just before the blizzard hit, my supervisor handed me a small parcel. No return address, no markings, just a name scrawled in fading ink, E. Marlowe. The delivery location was even stranger, a rundown cabin at the edge of Miller's Hollow, a place locals usually avoided. "You sure this isn't a prank?" I asked. My supervisor shrugged. They paid extra, said it was urgent. I drove through thickening snow for nearly an hour before reaching the turnoff. The road was barely visible beneath the snowfall, and the trees loomed like shadowy figures in the white haze. The deeper I went, the worse the feeling in my gut became, like something was waiting for me. Eventually, I spotted the cabin, an old, decaying structure, barely held together. The front porch sagged. The windows were clouded with frost, and a thin column of smoke rose from the chimney. Someone was inside. I parked, grabbed the package, and trudged through the snow. I knocked once, no answer. I knocked again, still nothing. Just as I was about to leave, the door creaked open on its own. I hesitated, then called out, "Delivery for E. Marlowe." No reply. I stepped inside cautiously, intending to just drop the package and go, but the moment I crossed the threshold, the air changed. It was frigid inside, colder than outside. The walls were lined with old paintings, portraits of somber faces that seemed to watch me. There were melted candles on every surface, their wax pooled in strange patterns. Something about the place made my skin crawl. I set the package on a nearby table and turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. I rushed to open it, but the handle wouldn't budge. It felt like it had been sealed from the outside. My breath clouded the air, and I noticed something strange. The floor was covered in a thin layer of snow, even though the windows were closed and the fireplace had long gone cold. Then came the whisper, low, curling voices that rose from the corners of the room. I spun around trying to locate them, but they came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The room dimmed and the portraits seemed to shift. The eyes in the paintings no longer looked painted, they looked real. A gust of wind blew through the cabin, scattering ash from the fireplace. And that's when I saw it. A figure in the corner, half hidden in shadow. Tall, cloaked in black, with a head wrapped in cloth like an old funerary shroud. It didn't move, it didn't breathe, it just stood there, watching. I backed away, but the floorboards beneath me groaned and cracked. A section collapsed, and I fell hard into a crawl space beneath the cabin. I landed in a shallow pit filled with bones, not animal, but human, old, brittle, and countless. I scrambled up in horror, clawing at the floor to climb out. But the hole was deep, and the whispers were louder down. They filled my ears, echoing like chants. Return, return, return. A hand reached down suddenly, not the figures, but a skeletal hand from the pile, pulling at my ankle, trying to drag me deeper. I screamed, kicked it off, and finally managed to climb out. The figure was gone. The door was open again. I didn't think, I just ran. I stumbled through the snow, heart racing, until I reached my truck. I sped away, half expecting the thing to be sitting in the back seat or standing in the road ahead. When I returned to town, I told my supervisor everything. He looked at me pale-faced and said, "That cabin? That place has been abandoned for over 40 years. No one's lived there since Enoch Marlowe died." I demanded to know more. He eventually told me that Marlowe was a reclusive occultist, believed to have vanished during a storm just like the one that night. Some say he performed strange rituals in that cabin, summoning things that weren't meant to be. Others said he died, but his spirit never left, and neither did the spirits he brought through. I returned the next day with the sheriff, but the cabin wasn't there anymore. Just a clearing, snow-covered, undisturbed. No structure, no ashes, no footprints, nothing. But I still have that package. I found it in my truck afterward, even though I left it on the table. I never opened it. I don't dare. I wrapped it in layers and buried it deep in the woods miles away, hoping that would be the end of it. But on the coldest nights, I hear it again. Whispers, knocks, and sometimes I find snow inside my apartment, melted in the shape of footprints, leading toward my bedroom. Something followed me back. It was the kind of storm that silences everything. No birds, no wind against the trees, no passing cars, just the steady hush of snow swallowing the world. I was house-sitting for a friend who lived in a secluded cabin deep in the northern woods. He'd gone on a month-long trip to Europe, and I'd agreed to stay and watch over the place. I thought it would be peaceful, quiet, cozy, a break from my hectic life in the city. I couldn't have been more wrong. The first few days were fine. I settled in, chopped wood, read by the fireplace, even started writing in an old leather journal I found in one of the drawers. The storm rolled in on the fifth night, thick flurries, biting wind, and temperatures dropping well below zero. The weather reports warned everyone to stay indoors. That wasn't a problem. I had everything I needed. But something changed with that storm. It began with footsteps. That first night as I lay in bed reading, I heard the distinct sound of crunching snow outside the bedroom window. Slow, deliberate steps, moving around the house. I froze. The cabin was miles from the nearest neighbor. I turned off my lamp and listened closely. The steps circled once, then faded. The next morning, I found the tracks. They weren't from an animal. They were human. Bare feet, no shoes, just bare footprints in the snow. And not just one set, there were two, side by side, pacing around the house, then stopping beneath every window. I told myself it was a prank, some local messing around. But something about the prints unnerved me. They were deep. Whoever made them was heavy, and the stride was like whoever or whatever. It was walked with an uneven gait. That night, it escalated. The wind howled endlessly, rattling the walls. I could barely sleep. Around midnight, I heard a soft tapping at the window behind the fireplace. I turned and saw nothing, just snow-covered glass. But then came a second knock, 3 slow taps. I crept to the window and stared out into the dark. A shape stood at the tree line, tall, gaunt, with elongated limbs. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself I was seeing things. I tried not to panic, but the unease stayed with me. By the third night, the knocking came from every window, always in sets of 3. The fireplace sputtered despite a full stack of wood, and the cabin grew colder no matter how many layers I wore. It felt like the storm had brought something with it, something that had now settled around the house. Then I noticed the journal I'd been writing in wasn't empty when I found it. The first few pages were filled with entries from someone else, dated back over 10 years. The writing was frantic, unhinged, descriptions of shadowy figures in the woods, voices in the snow, dreams of a pale, faceless woman crawling across the ceiling. One entry stood out: "She knocks until you answer. Don't open the door." Don't speak to her. And whatever you do, don't look at her face. I tried to convince myself it was a prank, a piece of fiction, but deep down, I knew better. The next night, I woke up to a freezing draft. The bedroom window was open. Snow blew in through the gap. I know I locked it, double-checked it, in fact, but it was wide open. The lock broken from the inside. On the floor were wet, bare footprints, leading from the window to the bed and back again. Something had stood over me while I slept. I almost left that night, packed a bag, stood at the door, with my keys shaking in my hand. But the wind was too strong, and I could barely see past the porch. I didn't want to die in the snow, so I stayed, regretful. The final night, I saw her. I was sitting by the fireplace, clutching the journal, trying to figure out what I was dealing with. The fire dimmed, the room grew colder than ever, and I saw a shape move across the hallway mirror, slowly, elegantly. I turned. No one was there. Then, in the reflection, she stepped into view. A tall woman in tattered white, hair soaked with ice, face covered by a veil. Her arms moved in unnatural way, jerky like a puppet with broken strings. She raised one hand and tapped the glass from the other side, 3 times. I ran. I grabbed my bag, my coat, and bolted into the storm. I didn't care that I couldn't see. I didn't care that my skin burned from the wind. I ran until I reached the main road and flagged down a plow truck. The driver said I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I didn't correct him. When my friend returned weeks later, he called me, furious, said the place was wrecked, windows shattered from the inside, scratches on the walls, candles melted into strange symbols. He accused me of a breakdown. I didn't argue. I never went back. But a few weeks ago, I received a package with no return address. Inside was the journal. I hadn't seen it since the night I ran. On the last page, written in unfamiliar, scratchy handwriting, were 6 words. You looked at her face. Now she knows you. And that night, in the frost on my apartment window, I saw 3 long, slender fingerprints. The storm had already begun by the time I reached the cabin. Thick sheets of snow blanketed the forest road, and the temperature had dropped so low it felt like the cold was crawling under my skin. I was there to help my cousin Mason. He'd recently moved into a remote rental cabin to get away from it all after a messy divorce, and I hadn't heard from him in weeks. No texts, no calls, nothing. At first, I thought he just needed space. But after 3 unanswered voicemails and a cryptic message he left on my phone a few days prior, just static, faint whispering, and then one frantic word, don't come. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The cabin sat at the edge of a dense forest cliff, surrounded by towering pines and frozen silence. When I pulled up, I noticed immediately that the snow around the house was untouched. No footprints, no tire marks, no signs of life. I knocked. No answer. The door was unlocked, creaking open with a gust of wind. The first thing that hit me wasn't the cold, it was the smell. Damp wood, mold, and something faintly metallic underneath, like rust or blood. The place was dark. The lights didn't work. The fireplace was long dead. The kitchen table was overturned, and Mason's coat was still hanging on the wall hook, stiff with ice. I called out his name again and again, but the only response was the wind screaming through the cracks in the walls. Then I saw his journal on the floor, pages soaked and curling from moisture. The writing was frantic, scribbled in shaky lines, some torn out entirely. Most entries made little sense, but a few stuck with me. It stands by the tree line, just watches, every night, closer. The snow isn't just snow. It moves when I'm not looking. It keeps whispering, says I belong here now. The last entry was only a single sentence. It knows I can hear it now. I started searching the cabin more thoroughly. Every room more unsettling than the last. The mirrors had been covered in black cloth, windows smeared with ash, and strange symbols scratched into the floor beneath the furniture, circles, jagged lines, spirals, with human teeth wedged into the grooves. I found Mason's phone beneath the bed. The screen was cracked, but it still powered on. I opened his voice memos. There were dozens of recordings. Most were just long stretches of silence or static, but one stood out. In it, Mason is whispering, I don't sleep anymore. Every time I close my eyes, it's there. Not in my dreams, but behind them. It gets in through the cold, through the silence, through the snow. It's not a person, not a ghost. It's older. It wears the storm like a mask. The sound cuts off, then faint breathing. Then a whisper, not Mason. You shouldn't have. I turned off the phone and stood in silence, heart pounding. That's when I heard it. The creak of the front door opening slowly again. I hadn't touched it. I crept toward it, but found it wide open. Snow swirling in and bare footprints leading inside. Fresh wet prints melting into the wooden floorboards. I backed away. The cabin grew colder. The fireplace sparked violently, even though it had been out for hours. Then came the knock, not at the front door, from the attic. 3 soft thuds, like something knocking from above. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly climbed the ladder. The attic was small and empty, except for a chair in the middle of the floor. Sitting upright in that chair was a life-sized figure made entirely of snow, sculpted crudely but unmistakably human. Its mouth was wide open, frozen in a scream, and inside the mouth was Mason's wedding ring. Then I noticed something else. Scratch marks all along the walls, clawed into the wood as if someone had tried desperately to escape. On the far side of the attic, a second chair had been set up facing the snow figure, and sitting in that chair was a decayed body, Mason's, face twisted in terror, eyes wide open, mouth agape. As I screamed, the figure began to melt, but not from heat, from something underneath, something moving, something black and fluid-like, oozed from beneath its base, seeping across the attic floor toward me. I bolted down the ladder, nearly falling, and ran outside without thinking. I didn't look back. I drove all night, even through the whiteout, until I reached town. I called the authorities, but when they arrived at the cabin, Mason's body was gone. The attic was empty. No snow figure, no journal, nothing. They told me it was stress, a hallucination, but I know what I saw. Now, whenever it snows, I hear knocking in my apartment, from inside the walls, from under the floor, and sometimes from the attic above me. Even though I live in a single-story building, I still dream of that figure made of snow, its mouth open in silent horror, and something black crawling just beneath the surface. I hadn't spoken to my Uncle Greg in over 5 years when he called out of the blue one December afternoon. His voice was shaky, breathless, and barely coherent, but I caught enough to understand he needed help. He lived in a small mountain town in the north, the kind of place that disappears under snow for half the year. He'd inherited an old family lodge near the summit, a sprawling, creaky structure half swallowed by frost and isolation. "I need you to come up," he said, words trembling. "Something's wrong here. It's in the snow. It watches through the windows. I can't be alone anymore." The call dropped right after that. I tried calling back. Nothing. Against my better judgment, I packed a bag, threw chains on my tires, and made the drive up through winding, ice-covered roads. By the time I reached the lodge, the snowstorm had already begun. Heavy flakes swirled sideways, and the sky was the kind of gray that pressed down on your chest. The place looked worse than I remember. Shutters hung loose, parts of the roof were sagging under snow weight, and the windows were completely frosted over. I knocked, but no one answered. When I pushed the door open, it groaned like it hadn't moved in years. Inside, the heat was barely functioning, and the air had that stale, forgotten scent of old wood and dust. But more than that, it felt occupied, like someone or something was standing just behind the silence, holding its breath. I found Uncle Greg sitting in the living room, wrapped in blankets, staring at the fireplace. He looked thinner, older, like the snow had drained something from him. His eyes were bloodshot and distant. "You came," he muttered. "It gets stronger when it storms. I think it knows I'm trying to leave." I didn't understand what he meant. He didn't explain. That night, after we ate in silence, he gave me a flashlight and told me to lock my bedroom door. I thought it was paranoia, just a man living alone in the cold for too long, until the knocking started. It was faint at first, a light tap, tap, tap on the bedroom window. Then again, then louder. I looked outside, but the snowstorm was too thick to see anything, just an endless blur of white. And then I noticed it, a face pressed against the glass, but it wasn't a person. The face was long and angular, skin tight like wet parchment over bone, and its eyes were hollow, no pupils, pits of black ice. I backed away, heart racing, and the tapping stopped. The next morning, I told Uncle Greg what I saw. He didn't even look surprised. He just said, "That's the collector. It waits, it knocks, and if you open the door, it takes something." I laughed nervously, thinking it was just local legend nonsense, but he showed me the attic. It was filled with dozens of shoes, gloves, scarves, coats, all weathered and frozen stiff, items from people who'd visited and never returned. There were photos, too, some old, some new, all blurry, all showing the same figure, always somewhere in the background, tall, draped in tattered, snow-covered fabric, watching. Uncle Greg believed it wasn't just haunting the lodge. It was feeding off it, drawing strength from isolation and storm. He said it started after our grandfather brought home an artifact from a failed Arctic expedition, a twisted iron medallion etched with runes none of us could read. He'd kept it in a glass case in the study. I found that case shattered. That night, the tapping returned, this time at every window, every wall. It was like the storm had a pulse. And when I looked out the front door's peephole, I saw them, dozens of figures made of snow and ice, all standing still, motionless, their heads tilted upward, as if listening to something only they could hear. Uncle Greg broke down. "It took my voice once," he whispered. "I couldn't speak for 3 days. Then it gave it back, changed. He begged me to help him burn the artifact, said it was the only way to sever the connection. We smashed it with a hammer and tossed the pieces into the fireplace. That's when the screaming started. Not from outside, from the walls, the floor, the ceilings. 1,000 muffled screams, echoing like they were buried under the foundation. The fire flickered blue, then died. Every window shattered at once, snow pouring into the house like a living thing. I don't remember how I got out. I woke up halfway down the mountain trail, frostbitten and disoriented, found hours later by a rescue team. They said the storm had knocked out radio signals for miles. When they reached the lodge, it was empty. No sign of Uncle Greg, no furniture, no footprints, just a single thing left in the fireplace ashes. The medallion, whole again, unburnt. I haven't spoken about this to anyone since, but now, every time a snowstorm hits, I hear tapping on my windows again. Always 3 knocks, always at 3 a.m. And last week, I found something buried in the snow outside my apartment. One of the shoes from the attic, frozen stiff, still bearing my uncle's initials inside the heel. I used to think snowstorms were beautiful, peaceful, serene. That was before I got trapped in one, before I realized what can hide in all that white. Last winter, I agreed to house sit for a friend, Marissa, while she went on vacation. Her place was a cozy little house on the outskirts of a rural town, just past the woods and up a steep hill that was always the first to freeze during winter. She assured me it would be relaxing, a quiet break from the chaos of city life. The first few days were uneventful. I worked remotely, read a few books, lit the fireplace at night. The house creaked a little, but it had character. The kind of place that made you want to wrap up in a blanket and drink hot cocoa. Then, the storm came. It started slow, just flurries. By nightfall, it had escalated into a full whiteout. Visibility dropped to 0, the power flickered, and by the next morning, I was completely snowed in. The roads were impassable, the phone signal had dropped, and the radio only played a looping emergency weather alert. Still, I wasn't panicked. I figured it would pass in a day or two. I had food, firewood, candles. But then, strange things started happening. It began with the footprints. I woke up one morning to find a trail of them in the backyard. Bare human footprints in the snow, leading from the woods to the back door. Not boot prints, bare feet. Dozens. I stared out the window, chilled. There were no prints leading away, just toward the house, and they vanished beneath the back steps. That same night, I heard something scratching at the back door. At first, I thought it was a branch swaying, but then I heard it again. A deliberate, slow scratching, like nails dragging down. When I worked up the courage to open the door, there was nothing, just and a strange indentation beneath the steps, like something had been crawling under the house. By the third day, the storm hadn't let up, and neither had the noises. I started hearing faint knocking, not just on doors, but on the walls, the windows, even the attic ceiling above me. Always soft, rhythmic, like someone trying to find a way in without being noticed. I told myself it was wind, branches, ice. I wanted to believe that, but then I found the photos. Marissa had never mentioned a basement, but I found the door behind a bookshelf. It was locked, but the key was hanging by the fireplace. I opened it out of curiosity, and I wish I hadn't. Down there, buried under old boxes and storage bins, was a trunk. Inside were dozens of old photographs, all taken in the house, all of people I didn't recognize. In every picture, there was something strange in the background. A tall, thin figure standing outside the windows, always watching, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always there. And then I found the last photo in the box, a picture of me, taken from outside through the living room window. I hadn't taken it. I'd never seen it before, and the figure was right behind me in the reflection. I slammed the trunk shut and ran back upstairs. The house felt colder, darker, like something was watching me from just outside the edge of my... That night, I heard footsteps in the attic. Heavy, slow footsteps, pacing back and forth directly above my room. I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner with a fireplace poker in my hand, eyes locked on the ceiling until the morning light began to seep in through the frost-covered windows. But the storm still hadn't ended. On the 5th day, I found something even more disturbing. The footprints were back, but this time, they weren't just outside. They were inside, leading from the back door to the hallway, to the basement, to the attic stairs. They were wet, dark, and very real. I checked every window and door. Everything was still locked, nothing broken, nothing open, and yet something had been in the house while I slept. I tried to leave. I didn't care about the snow anymore. I just wanted to get out. But when I opened the front door, I froze. There were dozens of figures standing in the snow, scattered through the yard, and people made of snow, crudely shaped, lifeless. But each one was wearing real clothes, shoes, scarves, gloves, hats, items that I recognized from the photographs in the basement. One of the snow figures was wearing my coat. Another had my watch around its wrist. I slammed the door and barricaded it with furniture. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. I just waited. When the snow finally stopped on the seventh day, I was half delirious. The power came back, and so did my phone signal. I called Marissa, hysterical, begging her to explain what the hell had happened. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I thought it was gone. I thought, after the last storm, it had stopped. What are you talking about? I asked. Her voice cracked. It doesn't just come with the snow. It lives in it. It watches, it copies, and sometimes it replaces. She told me that years ago, during a similar storm, her cousin vanished while house sitting. All they found were snow figures in the yard. One of them looked just like him. I left that house the moment the roads cleared. I haven't seen Marissa since. I haven't spoken about it until now. But sometimes, in the middle of winter, I'll wake up and find snow melting on my floor, even when every door and window is locked. I don't go near the attic. And last week, I found a photo on my phone I don't remember taking. It's of me, sleeping, and in the background, by the window, stands a figure made of snow wearing my... I never liked winter much, but after what happened last year during that snowstorm, I've come to fear it in a way that's hard to explain. This isn't one of those stories you tell around a campfire or post online for cheap thrills. This is something I lived through, something that changed me in a way I can't undo. It started when I took a temporary job as a night guard at an old historical estate that had recently been turned into a museum. The place was called the Marrowest, massive, isolated, and sitting atop a snow-covered hill in the countryside. The job was simple enough. Monitor the cameras, do a few patrol rounds, and keep an eye on the antique displays. It paid decently, and with my savings running low, I couldn't say no. The first couple of nights were uneventful. The estate was eerie, sure. High ceilings, long corridors, antique furniture that seemed to whisper in the dark. But I chalked it all up to my imagination. I kept my flashlight close and did my rounds, ignoring the way the old paintings seemed to watch me as I walked by. Then came the snowstorm. It rolled in fast, howling winds, thick flakes, the whole place buried under white within hours. I figured I'd just be stuck for maybe 2 at most. I had supplies and a heater in the security room. I'd be fine. That night, something changed. The cameras started acting weird. They'd flicker, then show static, then cut back in with distorted images. At first, I thought it was just the storm messing with the signal. But then I noticed something off. In the camera feed for the Grand Hall, there was a figure, tall, pale, standing motionless near one of the statues. I switched to the next camera angle to get a better look. But when I did, the figure was gone. I ran down there, thinking maybe someone had broken in. But the hall was empty. No footprints in the snow that had drifted in from the slightly cracked window. Nothing. The next night, it got worse. The power flickered again, and I started hearing footsteps echoing through the halls, slow, dragging steps that didn't match the rhythm of my own. When I paused, they paused. When I moved, they continued on just a second behind me. I'd spin around with my flashlight, but there was never anything there. Then, I started finding doors open that I'd locked earlier. Items moved. A painting in the east corridor that had once shown a peaceful countryside scene now showed a snowy forest with dark figures in the trees. I thought I was going crazy until I looked through the glass covering the frame and realized the image itself had changed. Someone had swapped the canvas, or something had. I tried to call my supervisor, but the phone line was dead. My cell had no signal. I was completely cut off. So, I decided to stay locked in the security room and wait out the storm. That night, the cameras caught something I still can't explain. Every hallway had a figure in it, dozens of them. White, formless things like snowmen built from ash and ice. No facial features, no limbs, just humanoid shapes that shimmered faintly in the dim light. They stood completely still until I looked away. Each time I blinked or glanced at a different camera, they'd moved. Closer to the doors, closer to the camera lens. By the time I noticed them reaching the security room hallway, I was already pushing furniture against the door. Then the banging started. It wasn't loud, just a soft, steady thump, like fists made of snow gently tapping the wood. But it didn't stop. Not for hours. Even when I shouted, even when I cried, just that rhythmic thump, thump, thump. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke up to silence and daylight streaming through the tiny security room window. The storm had passed. I thought it was over. I packed my things and made a run for it as soon as the snowplow cleared the road. But before I left, I checked the cameras one last time, just to be sure, and I saw something that nearly made me drop my keys. There I was, still sitting in the security room chair on the screen, but I wasn't moving. I wasn't blinking. I wasn't breathing. The thing on the screen looked like me, but it wasn't me. Its skin was pale. Its eyes were completely white, and when it turned toward the camera, it smiled. A wide, cracked smile that split its face open like broken porcelain. I didn't wait around to see what happened next. I left and never went back. I quit the job, moved back to the city, tried to pretend none of it happened. But sometimes, in the dead of winter, I still see footprints outside my apartment window, bare footprints in the snow, leading toward my door. And last night I heard a soft, steady thumping on the other side of the wall. Thump, thump, thump.